Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Kamal Singh, Assistant Professor, Department of Economics, Central University of Himachal Pradesh, Dharamshala. Today we are going to discuss on the module Indifference Curve Analysis Part 2 from the paper Managerial Economics. In this module, we'll be studying about price effect, income effect, substitution effect, decomposition of price effect into income effect and substitution effect, and similarly we'll be discussing about different type of goods, normal goods, inferior goods and given goods. Under indifference curve analysis, you have studied that consumer equilibrium can be attained with the help of a tool called indifference curve analysis. Under indifference curve analysis, consumer equilibrium can be achieved if two conditions are fulfilled. One is known as the tangency condition, which says that at the point of equilibrium, indifference curve must be tangent to the budget line, or the slope of indifference curve should be equal to the slope of budget line. Under the second condition, it says that at the point of tangency, indifference curve should be convex to the region. In the preceding sections, we will be studying once the consumer equilibrium is attained, its certain changes occurs, say his income changes or the prices of the relative goods changes which the consumer is consuming. So how the consumer will adjust to these changes? When the consumer's money income change alone, prices of the goods, taste, etc., they remain same, the effect which will come is known as the income effect. Similarly, when the prices of only one good varies alone, keeping the income and the prices of other goods as constant and similarly other factors, it is known as the price effect. Now let's discuss about the price effect and the price consumption curve. Price of a good and its demand is inversely related. When the price of good changes, but the price of another good and money income of the consumer remains constant, quantity demanded also changes but in opposite direction of price changes. This effect is called price effect. And the curve which traces the price effect is called price consumption curve. Now let me explain you the price effect with the help of an example. Let us take two goods, X and Y. Let Px and Py are the prices of good X and good Y. M is consumer's money income. Now, if the price of good X changes, keeping the price of Y and M constant, the quantity demanded of X will also change. If the price of good falls, quantity demanded will increase and vice versa. So, price effect is the change in the consumption basket of the consumer which takes place due to change in the price alone. Now, let us discuss about the price effect and price consumption curve and how we can show them diagrammatically. In this diagram, good X and good Y is measured along horizontal and vertical axis. Initially, BL is the budget line and U1 is the indifference curve. Consumer is at equilibrium at point E, where the two conditions of consumer equilibrium, that is, the slope of indifference curve is equal to slope of budget line, and at the point of equilibrium, indifference curve is convex to origin, are met. At point E, consumer is consuming OX of good X and OY of good Y. Now the price of good X fall, but the price of good Y and his money income M is constant. Now as we have discussed that when the price of one good falls, keeping the price of other good and money income constant, the budget line will swell. It will tilt toward outside and becomes BL1. And the new consumer equilibrium is formed at point E1 at a higher indifference curve U2. Again here, both the condition of consumer equilibrium are satisfied. And at this point, consumer consumes OX1 of good 1 and OY1 of good Y. Similarly, When again price of good X fall and again the price of good Y and consumer income remain constant, another equilibrium is formed at point E2, where budget line is BL2 and indifference curve is U3. If we join all the equilibrium points, that is E, E1, E2, we get a curve called price consumption curve, which is the locus of the point of consumer equilibrium resulting from changes in the price of good X alone, other things remaining constant. Derivation of demand curve from price consumption curve. As discussed before, price consumption curve traces the effect of changes in price when all other factors which are affecting the demand they remain same. Demand curve, on the other hand, is the curve which traces the effect of change in the price of good and its quantity demanded. Now let us see how demand curve is derived from price consumption curve. In the above figure, it has two panels, panel A and panel B. In panel A, price effect is explained, and in panel B, demand curve is derived. Price effect is explained in our paragraph that PCC was formed by joining three equilibrium points, that is E, E1 and E2. In panel B, price of good X is plotted in vertical axis and quantity demanded of X is plotted in horizontal axis. All the 3 points of panel A are traced vertically in panel B. So we can see that at point E, 2 units of good X are consumed at point E1, 4 units at E2, 6 units of good X are demanded. Corresponding to point E, E1 and E2 in vertical axis, price is rupees 6, rupees 4 and rupees 2 respectively. When all these points are joined, we get a downward sloping curve which is called demand curve, which shows that as the price of good X falls, quantity demand of good X increases and vice versa with ceteris paribus. That means all other factors remaining constant. Now this curve is demand curve for good X. Now let's discuss about income effect. Income is an important variable which influences the consumption decision of the consumer. Level of the income of the consumer is the budget constraint within which the consumer has to make his consumption decision. When the consumer's income increases, he or she can consume more of the goods and services. And when the income of the consumer falls, he or she is forced to consume less, provided the other factors which influences the demand are constant. Changes in the consumer consumption decision are traced by what is known as income effect and income consumption curve. So, income effect is the effect in the consumer's equilibrium or his consumption basket, which results because of the changes in the consumer's real income, keeping the prices of the goods and services, consumers' taste and preferences as constant. Now let us derive income consumption curve and show income effect. Again, good X and good Y are plotted in horizontal and vertical axis. Initially, U1 is the indifference curve and BL1 is the budget line. Consumer equilibrium is at point E1, where two conditions of consumer equilibrium are attained. Here, consumer consumes OX of X good and OY of good Y. Now, let the income of the consumer changes. More specifically, let us assume that the income of the consumer increases, but all other factors remaining same. So what will happen? In this case, the budget line will shift upward to B1L1 and new consumer equilibrium is attained at point E2 with new indifference curve, that is U2, where consumer now consumes more of good X and more of good Y, that is OX1, OY1. Similarly, again, when the consumer's income increases, new budget line, that is B2L2 is formed and new consumer equilibrium is formed with new indifference curve U3 at point E3. Here again, consumer consumes more of good X and good Y. When all the three consumer equilibrium point, that is E1, E2 and E3, are joined, a curve is derived called income consumption curve. Income consumption curve traces the changes in consumer equilibrium, which is a result of changes in consumer income, ceteris paribus. Income effect can be both positive as well as negative. Income effect for a good is called positive if, with increase in income of the consumer, he consumes more of that good. The good which exhibit positive income effect is called normal good or superior good. It means their demand increases as the income of the consumer increases. Similarly, income effect for a good is called negative if, with increase in income, consumer consumes less of that good. The good which have negative income effect is called inferior good. Example, bajra, millet, etc. So, in the case of inferior good as well as given good, their demand falls with increase in the income of the consumer. Now, let us see the income effect in the case of inferior goods. Here again, good X and good Y are plotted on X-axis and Y-axis respectively. But now, good X is inferior good. Here, consumer initially at point I is consuming OX of X good and OY of Y good. Now, when the income of the consumer increases, his budget line shifts to MN and new indifference curve is U2 and new consumer equilibrium occurs at point H. Here the consumption of X becomes OX1. Similarly, further, when income increases, new equilibrium is attained at point K with budget line RS and indifference curve U3. Here, the consumption of X is OX2. In this figure, income consumption curve bends toward y-axis, which represents that when the income of the consumer increases, consumption of good X fall. So, we may say that good X is inferior good because the demand for good X falls with increase in income of the consumer. Similar diagram can be drawn for if we consider good Y as inferior, but in this case, income consumption curve will bend towards x-axis. Now let's talk about substitution effect. Substitute goods and complementary goods are two important categories of goods which are discussed in economics. Substitute goods are also called the competitive good and they can be used in place of one another. For example, tea and coffee. Now, if the price of one good changes, it has impact on the demand of another good. Let's discuss this with the example of tea and coffee. When the price of the tea falls relative to the price of the coffee, remember that the price of the coffee remains same. The demand for tea will increase and that of coffee will fall because in this case, tea is substitute for coffee. Substitution effect traces this effect of change in price of one good and its effect on demand for another good. Substitution effect takes place because of change in the relative prices. Under substitution effect, when the price of one good falls or increases, it becomes relatively cheaper or dearer than the other. In the above case, the consumer will substitute the cheaper good to the dearer good, or he will buy more of that good which has become cheaper and less of that good which has now become expensive. Remember, the price of another good has not changed. Substitution effect is always negative, which means that the relative price of a commodity and its quantity demanded, they change in opposite direction. It measures the increase in the quantity demanded of a good when its price fall, resulting only from the relative price decline and is independent of change in the real income. Decomposition of price effect into income effect and substitution effects. There are generally two methods which we follow to decompose the price effect into income effect and substitution effect. They are the Hickson method, named after the economist J.R. Hicks, and the Slutsky method. In the following module, we'll only discuss the decomposition of price effect into income effect and substitution effect with the help of Hickson method. As we discussed in the previous slide, that there are two approaches to decompose the price effect into income effect and substitution effect. For the decomposition of price effect, it is imperative to hold the real income of the consumer constant. Once we are able to hold the real income constant, we can measure the change in quantity demanded due to substitution effect, and the remaining change in the quantity demanded represents the change which has occurred due to income effect. To keep the real income constant, there are generally two methods, which are Hickson and Slutsky. Under Hickson method of eliminating the income effect, we reduce the consumer's money income, that is by taxation, so that the consumer remains on his original indifference curve, or that simply means that the level of satisfaction to the consumer remains same as he was getting before the change in the real income. Now let's come to the main issue, the decomposition of price effect into substitution effect and income effect. Let us first again revise what was the meaning of price effect, substitution effect and the income effect. Price effect, as discussed above, is the effect which traces the changes in the consumption basket of the consumer or the changes in the consumer equilibrium due to when it changes due to the price change alone, keeping all other factors as constant. On the other hand, income effect is the effect which traces the changes in the consumer's consumption decisions when his income alone changes, keeping the price and all other factors affecting as constant. On the other hand, substitution effect is the effect which takes place because of a change in the relative prices, and substitution effect traces this effect of change in the price of one good and its effect on the demand for another good. Now let's discuss it more briefly. Now initially, BL is the budget line which shows the combination of two goods which the consumer can consume given the price of its goods and money income. U1 is the indifference curve which is giving the combination of two goods which the consumer can consume given on all the combination on this indifference curve give him same level of satisfaction. Consumer equilibrium is at point P where consumer consumes OX of good X and OY of good Y. Price of good X falls, keeping price of good Y and his money income same. Now the budget line tilts and becomes BH. Remember, we have discussed that in this case the budget line will tilt because only the price of X is changing, the price of Y and his money income are remaining constant. So when the price of only one good changes, the budget line will tilt, and in this case because the prices of X has fallen, so budget line will tilt outward. Now what will happen, that the new equilibrium will be formed at new point, that is point Z. At point Z, consumer consumes OX2 of good X. Now the movement from point P to point Z is known as price effect, because here with the change in the prices of the good X, its demand has also changed. In this case, with a fall in the price of X, its demand has increased. Now this price effect is made up of two important effects, substitution effect and the income effect, and we have to isolate the substitution effect from the income effect. So will follow the Hicks approach. Now Hicks approach says, following the Hicks approach, and to keep his real income constant, he is taxed, and his increased real income is taxed so that he remains on same indifference curve, or his level of satisfaction remains same. Now we draw another budget line, TS, which is parallel to new budget line BM, and which shows that equal amount of income is taken away from the consumer, or the amount equal to increase in the real income. Remember, this new budget line is tangent to old indifference curve U1, and it's tangent at point R, which shows that the consumer's level of satisfaction is unaltered or unchanged, or he is at old level of satisfaction, that is at indifference curve U1. Movement from point P to point R is substitution effect, because this increase in quantity demanded of good X is a result of change in relative price. Means when the price of good X relative to good Y changes, good X becomes cheaper to its substitute, and consumer consumes more of cheap good than the costly one, or he will substitute now goods. So increase in quantity of good X from OX to OX1 is called substitution effect. Movement from point R to point Z is called income effect, because if consumer's income is not held constant, he will move from point R to point Z, which means with increase in consumer's income, his consumption of good X will also increase. So increase in quantity demanded of good X with fall in price of good X is called income effect. Now we can summarize that the price effect is equal to substitution effect plus income effect. Now in this case, the movement from point P to point Z, or movement from point X to X2, is the price effect, and it constitutes two parts, substitution effect and income effect. From movement from X to X1 is the substitution effect, and movement from point X1 to X2 is the income effect. And when both of these two effects are joined, they form the price effect. Income effect and substitution effect of price change in case of normal, inferior and Giffen goods. Now let's discuss what are normal goods. In the case of normal goods, income effect is positive. That means with increase in the income, demand for normal goods also increases. The substitution, as we have discussed before, it's always negative, meaning that when the price of normal good falls, it becomes relatively cheaper to its substitute, and the consumer will buy more of a cheaper good than expensive good. So the demand for normal goods increases. Finally, the price effect indicate that when the price of normal good fall, its demand will increase. So the law of demand holds valid in the case of normal goods, and the demand curve slopes downward. Now let's discuss inferior goods. In case of inferior goods, income effect is negative. That is, with increase in the income of the consumer, the demand for inferior goods falls, as discussed in the preceding paragraphs. The substitution effect is always negative, meaning that when the price of inferior good falls, it becomes cheaper to its substitute, so the demand increases. In the case of inferior goods, the substitution effect is strong, and it outweighs the negative income effect. So the final effect, that is the price effect, indicate that when the price of inferior good falls, the demand increases. So the law of demand holds valid and demand curve slopes downward. That simply means that when the price of the inferior good falls, their demand will increase. Now the Giffen goods. Giffen goods are named after the British economist Sir Robert Giffen. These goods are special case of inferior goods. In case of Giffen goods, income effect is negative. That is, with increase in the income, demand for Giffen good falls. The substitution effect, as we have discussed, is always negative, meaning that when the price of Giffen good fall, it becomes cheaper to its substitute. So the demand should increase. But in the case of Giffen goods, the substitution effect is weak and is outweighed by the negative income effect. So the final effect, that is the price effect, indicates that when the price of inferior goods fall, the demand also fall for the given goods. So the law of demand does not hold valid, and the demand curve for given goods slopes upward, which means that with increase in the price of a given good, the demand for given good also increases and vice versa. Now let's come to the conclusion. Price effect, income effect, and substitution effect are one of the most important concepts in microeconomic theory. Income effect traces out the effect in the consumer's consumption decision when the income changes alone, keeping other factors constant. This effect helps us to understand about the normal and inferior goods. Substitution effect traces the effect in the consumer equilibrium when the relative price changes alone, other factors are kept constant. Price effect traces what happens when the price of good alone changes, other factors are constant. The decomposition of price effect into income effect and substitution effect is of pertinent use. The decomposition highlights that the price effect is in fact is the combination of income effect and the substitution effect. When the price of a good changes, two changes undertake place. One, the consumer's real income increases, and because of change in his real income, he buys more of that good. Second, the good whose price has fallen becomes cheaper in relation to another good. So, the consumer purchases more of the cheaper good and less of expensive good. So, when price falls, demand increases, partly because due to changes in the real income of the consumer, and partly because now the good has become cheaper than its substitute. Second important issue which is highlighted by this decomposition is that it traces out the exception to law of demand, or in which cases the demand curve slopes upward also. This case is highlighted when the negative income effect outweighs the substitution effect. Similarly, we have seen that to decompose the price effect, it is important to isolate the income effect and the substitution effect. For this, there are two approaches, Hickson and Slutsky approach. Hickson approach, which keeps the real income of the consumer constant, and because of this, it becomes very easy to isolate substitution effect from income effect.